They say a woman's life transforms the moment she decides it's time. For me, that change began on a scorching July afternoon, the kind where the air shimmers and every sound feels unnervingly close. Standing in my kitchen rinsing lunch plates, I caught sight of them, two identical figures, shirtless, tanned, and dripping with sweat, unloading boxes from a truck into the house next door. Ethan and Eric were new to the neighborhood, fresh faces breaking the dull monotony of suburban life. Twins in their early 20s, they carried themselves with a blend of youthful arrogance and charm, the kind of confidence that commands attention whether you intend to give it or not. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was childish to stare, but my gaze kept drifting back to the window. Jake, my husband, sat in the living room, glued to his sports channel, as oblivious as ever. That was our marriage in a nutshell: routine, predictable, and devoid of spark. Later that day, as I watered the garden, the twins appeared on their porch. "Hey there," one of them called out, his grin magnetic. I couldn't tell them apart yet, but managed a polite "Hi," adjusting the hem of my sundress. "Welcome to the neighborhood." They walked over, their presence both unsettling and exhilarating. Up close, their similarities were striking: same piercing green eyes, same chiseled jawlines, but subtle differences stood out. Ethan, as I later discovered, was the more outspoken one, with a sharp wit that made me laugh in ways I hadn't in years. Eric, quieter and more thoughtful, spoke with a deliberate charm that was no less intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as Jake's wife or someone's mother, but just as me. The first undeniable spark came a week later when Ethan was fixing his car in the driveway. Jake was at work, and I found myself wandering over under the pretense of borrowing tools for a household repair. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and gave me a look that lingered just a second too long. "You into cars?" he asked, leaning casually against the hood. "Not really," I admitted, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. "You should be," he said with a grin. "They're like people. You take care of them, and they take care of you." His gaze locked with mine, and the way he said it made my stomach tighten. That night, as Jake snored beside me, I replayed the interaction over and over in my head. It was just harmless conversation, I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. A few days later, Eric caught me pruning the roses. He leaned against the fence, his voice smooth and deliberate as he complimented the flowers. "They're beautiful, must take a lot of patience." "Not as much as you'd think," I replied, keeping my hands busy to hide their trembling. "And what about you, Melissa? Are you the patient type?" His question hung in the air, heavy and charged. I hesitated, feeling the pull of his words but unsure how to respond. In that moment, I realized something dangerous was unfolding. By the time I returned to the house, my heart was racing, and my hands were shaking. I told myself I wouldn't go back out there, wouldn't give them another moment of my attention. But even as I closed the door, I couldn't stop wondering if they had felt it too. "It's just curiosity," I reasoned, harmless. But the truth was, I hadn't felt this alive in years. By the end of the week, I found myself making excuses to be outside whenever I heard their voices, watering the plants, checking the mailbox, even taking out the trash twice in one day. The twins noticed, of course. They always noticed. Every glance, every smile, every fleeting touch made me feel like a woman again. But it wasn't just physical, they listened. They asked questions. They remembered the little things I said, things Jake never bothered with anymore. They made me feel important, desired, alive. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself standing at the fence again. Ethan handed me a glass of lemonade he'd made, his fingers brushing mine. "You've got a spark in you, Melissa," he said, his voice low and inviting. "You just need someone to bring it out." I didn't respond. He couldn't. His words had knocked the air out of me. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I knew I was standing at a crossroads. Part of me wanted to pull back, to shut it all down before it went too far. But the other part, the one that had been starved of passion and connection for years, was already leaning over the edge, ready to fall. The morning after, Ethan's words lingered in my head. I tried to act like everything was normal. I made breakfast for Jake, packed his lunch, and waved him off as he backed out of the driveway. But my hands trembled as I washed the dishes, and I couldn't stop stealing glances out the window, wondering if the twins were outside. By mid-morning, I found an excuse to water the garden again, even though it had rained the night before. Sure enough, Ethan and Eric were there, lounging on their porch like two bronze gods. Ethan saw me first, his grin as sharp as ever. "Morning, Melissa," he called out, his voice rich and teasing. "Taking care of those flowers again?" "I guess I just like things to look perfect," I replied, surprised by the playful edge in my tone. Eric joined him at the railing, his gaze steady and far more intense than his brother's. "You've got a real talent for it," he said softly. "You make this place feel alive." I felt my cheeks heat as I turned back to my roses, pretending to adjust a branch. But their words stayed with me, buzzing in my chest like a secret I couldn't contain. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and quiet thrills. Ethan started finding reasons to come over, borrowing tools, returning them, or just stopping by to chat. Every interaction left me feeling like I was rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. Eric often found subtle ways to captivate me, lingering at the fence to ask about my day, listening intently in a way Jake hadn't in years. What started as harmless interactions, a laugh here, a touch there, soon took on a different tone. Ethan began leaning a little too close when handing me something, while Eric's gaze lingered just a moment too long. And the truth? I didn't stop them. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Ethan invited me over to check out their new barbecue setup. Jake was working late again, and the kids were at a friend's house. I hesitated, torn between guilt and an undeniable pull, but eventually, I gave in. The smoky aroma of grilled meat filled the air as Ethan handed me a cold beer. Eric sat close at the picnic table, his arm brushing mine. Conversation flowed effortlessly, but beneath the surface was a dangerous tension, electric and impossible to ignore. At one point, Ethan leaned in, his voice low and deliberate. "You don't belong here, Melissa. Not in this quiet little life. You're too vibrant for all this." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond, but when Eric's hand brushed mine under the table, I didn't pull away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed their words, their touches, the way they made me feel alive again, seen, desired. It's harmless, I told myself. Just a little fun to distract from the monotony of my life. But deep down, I knew better. Things escalated a few nights later when I received a text from Ethan while Jake sat on the couch watching yet another game. My heart raced as I read the words. "Can't stop thinking about you." I froze, the message burning in my hand. I glanced at Jake, who didn't notice, never noticed. Quickly, I typed back. "This isn't a good idea." His reply came instantly. "Sometimes the best things aren't." My pulse raced as I set my phone down, exhilarated and terrified all at once, feeling like a teenager sneaking out past curfew. The next morning, Eric was waiting for me at the fence. "You didn't respond to Ethan last night," he said, his tone gentle but probing. I stared at him, my voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know about that?" His smile was knowing, his eyes gleaming. "We share everything, Melissa, always have." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I should have walked away then and there, but instead, I found myself leaning closer, caught in the gravity of his gaze. "You're playing a dangerous game," I said, my voice trembling. He smirked and replied softly. "And yet, here you are," his hand brushing mine. That night, as Jake snored beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I felt trapped between two worlds: the safe, predictable life I had built with Jake, and the thrilling, intoxicating pull of something forbidden. By the end of the week, I couldn't deny it anymore. I had crossed the line. The stolen glances, the quiet touches, the late-night texts, they weren't innocent. Yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop. The tension finally came to a head one afternoon when Ethan cornered me in the kitchen. Jake was at work, the kids were at school, and I had foolishly let Ethan in to fix the sink. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low and accusing. "I'm trying to keep things normal," I replied, my voice trembling. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. "And is this normal?" he asked, brushing his hand against my cheek. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because, in that moment, normal was the last thing I wanted. There's a point where the weight of what you're hiding becomes suffocating, pressing down on your chest like a heavy truth. I reached that point the morning Jake finally noticed a change in me. "You're distracted," he said over breakfast, his tone flat, as if commenting on the weather. "I'm just tired," I lied, forcing a smile and sipping my coffee. He nodded, already turning back to his phone. That was Jake, uninterested, detached. Strangely, I was grateful for his indifference. It gave me the space to navigate the tangled mess I had created. But the twins weren't waiting anymore. Ethan, bold and relentless, began texting me at all hours, his messages growing more explicit with time. Eric, softer but equally dangerous, caught me at the fence, pulling secrets from me I didn't even know I was willing to share. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, my phone buzzed on the counter. Another text from Ethan. "Come over, just for a drink. Eric's grilling steaks." Jake was upstairs taking a shower, and the kids were out with friends. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen, knowing exactly what would happen if I went. Yet, I couldn't resist. Their house was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of charred meat and something darker, something unspoken. Ethan greeted me at the door, his grin wicked and knowing. "Glad you could make it," he said, his hand lingering on my waist as he guided me inside. Eric was in the kitchen, moving with quiet precision as he plated the steaks. "We saved you a seat," he said, gesturing to the table set for 3. I sat between them, the tension so palpable it was almost suffocating. Ethan poured me a glass of wine, his fingers brushing mine as he handed it over. Eric leaned closer, his voice low and intimate, as though the air between us held a secret only we understood. "You've been on our minds, Melissa," Ethan said, his words wrapping around me like a vice. I took a slow sip of wine, hoping to steady my trembling hands. This is dangerous," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "That's what makes it exciting," Ethan replied, his grin widening as if daring me to argue. Dinner drifted into intimate conversation, the kind that felt far too close, too personal. They asked about my dreams, my regrets, my marriage, and I answered, each word spilling out like a confession. By the time I stood to leave, the wine had loosened my tongue and dulled my caution. Ethan followed me to the door, his hand brushing mine as he leaned in, his voice low. "You don't have to go," he murmured, his breath warm against my skin. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "I can't stay," I managed to whisper, though my feet remained rooted in place. Eric appeared behind him then, his piercing gaze locking onto mine. "Melissa," he said softly, his tone smooth and deliberate, "no one has to know." The air between us felt heavy, crackling with tension. For a moment, I leaned slightly toward them, the pull of their words too strong to resist. But then, a sudden noise outside, a car door slamming, a dog barking snapped me back to reality. "I have to go," I said again, my voice firmer this time. They didn't try to stop me, but their eyes followed me as I stepped out the door, their gazes heavy with promises I wasn't sure I wanted them to keep. The next day, I avoided the twins entirely. I stayed inside, throwing myself into chores, ignoring Ethan's texts as they lit up my phone. But the guilt lingered, gnawing at me like a constant reminder of how far I'd let things go. Jake noticed my unease, of course, but as always, he didn't press me for answers. His indifference only made the guilt worse. By the end of the week, I was a wreck of nerves and regret, but I kept holding on until Jake came home early one afternoon, and everything unraveled. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up from lunch, when I heard the front door open. Jake's heavy footsteps echoed through the house. I turned toward him, a smile plastered on my face. "Hey," I began, but the words died in my throat as I caught the look on his face. He held up my phone, the screen lit with a message from Ethan. "Can't stop thinking about last night." "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. My heart stopped. "Jake, I can explain," I stammered, but he cut me off sharply. "Explain? What's there to explain, Melissa? You've been lying to me. Sneaking around with the neighbors like some teenager." Tears welled in my eyes as I scrambled to find the words, but they wouldn't come. "How long has this been going on?" he shouted, his voice rising. "How far have you gone?" "I didn't, nothing happened," I lied, the words bitter on my tongue. Jake stared at me, his face a storm of anger and pain. "Do you think I'm stupid?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Do you think I haven't noticed what's been happening right under my nose?" I opened my mouth to respond, but he didn't let me. "You know what, Melissa? I'm done. I'm not going to sit here and play the fool while you destroy our family." He threw the phone onto the counter and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening, yet it felt as though the walls were screaming at me. My hands trembled as I picked up the phone Jake had thrown, Ethan's text still glowing on the screen like a damning confession. Without thinking, I deleted the message, as though erasing it could somehow undo the damage that had already been done. My mind raced, but there was no escaping the truth. The cracks I had tried to hide for so long had finally shattered my world. Trying to figure out how to fix everything felt impossible. How do you undo something that should have never happened? For hours, I paced the house, waiting for Jake to return. When he didn't, I called him, but every call went straight to voicemail. I texted him, apologizing, begging him to come home, but there was no reply. The weight of my guilt was suffocating, relentless, crushing me with every passing moment. The next morning, the sound of my phone buzzing pulled me from a restless sleep. For a fleeting second, I thought it might be Jake, but it wasn't. It was Ethan. "Come over, we need to talk." I stared at the message, anger bubbling inside me. This was his fault, their fault. They had pushed me, manipulated me, and now my marriage was hanging by a thread because of them. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and stormed over to their house. Ethan opened the door, his expression smug, as though he had been expecting me. "You've got some nerve," I snapped, shoving past him into the house. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I didn't force you to do anything, Melissa," he said coolly. "You wanted this as much as we did." Eric appeared from the kitchen, his calm demeanor only fueling my frustration. "We should sit down and talk about this," he said, his voice measured. "I don't want to sit down," I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. "I want you two to leave me alone. Whatever this is, it's over." Ethan smirked, stepping closer. "You think you can just walk away? That's cute." Eric's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Ethan, enough." He turned to me, his expression softening. "Melissa, we didn't mean for things to get this complicated. We never wanted to hurt you." "Well, you did," I snapped, tears streaming down my face. "You ruined everything." Eric opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of a car door slamming outside froze us all. It was Jake. He stood in the driveway, his face a storm of fury and pain. My stomach dropped as he marched up to the house and pounded on the door. "Melissa," he shouted. "I know you're in there." Panic surged through me as I turned to Ethan and Eric. "Don't say anything," I whispered, my voice frantic. Ethan shrugged, looking completely unbothered, while Eric's jaw tightened in frustration. Jake didn't wait for an invitation. He shoved the door open, his eyes immediately locking onto me. "So this is where you've been sneaking off to," he said, his voice low and venomous. "It's not what it looks like," I stammered, but even as I spoke, I knew the words sounded hollow. Jake turned to the twins, his fists clenched at his sides. "You two stay the hell away from my wife." Ethan stepped forward, his grin cocky and unapologetic. "Maybe you should ask your wife what she wants." That was all it took. Jake lunged at him, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Eric tried to step between them, but Jake shoved him aside as he and Ethan grappled, their shouts echoing through the house. "Stop it," I screamed, but neither of them listened. Finally, Eric managed to separate them, his voice booming. "Enough." Jake turned to me, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with anger and betrayal. "I can't do this anymore, Melissa. I can't. You've destroyed us." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Before I could respond, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I didn't go after him. I couldn't. I just stood there, numb, as the reality of what I had done sank in. The silence in the room was deafening until Eric spoke, his voice soft and cutting through the tension. "You should go." Ethan said nothing, but the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable as I turned and walked out of their house for the last time. The days that followed blurred into an endless haze of regret and silence. Jake didn't come home, and the kids avoided me like I was a disease. The life I had spent years building was crumbling around me, and there was no one to blame but myself. One night, as I sat alone in the darkened living room, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jake. "We need to talk." When Jake came home the next day, the tension was suffocating. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the silence stretching on endlessly. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. I don't even know who you are anymore. I opened my mouth to respond, but he held up a hand to stop me. I'm not here to fight, Melissa. I'm here to figure out what we're going to do. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I never meant for any of this to happen. Sorry doesn't fix this, he said, his voice cracking. Sorry doesn't undo what you did. I love you, I said desperately, but even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if they were still true. Jake stood, his expression unreadable. I need time to think, he said quietly, before walking out the door again. As the days turned into weeks, I realized that time might not be enough to fix what I had broken. The damage was done, and no apology could undo it. I had made my choices, and now I had to live with the consequences.